The house had always been too quiet at night. Since my husband's passing, the once comforting silence felt oppressive, the kind that pressed in on you, forcing you to confront the emptiness. I'd grown used to it over the years, though. A glass of wine, a book I wasn't really reading, and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway were my companions now. But since Nathan moved into the guest house a few weeks ago, the quiet wasn't the same. At first, I thought having him here would help fill the void, that the faint sounds of his footsteps across the yard, or the occasional laugh from his phone calls, would bring a sense of life back into the place. It did, in a way. But it also brought something else, something I hadn't anticipated. Nathan wasn't a boy anymore. He'd grown into a man without me noticing, his broad shoulders and confident smile so far removed from the awkward teenager who used to shuffle into the kitchen looking for snacks. He was 28 now, his energy vibrant and his presence magnetic. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure how to reconcile the boy I used to know with the man standing in front of me. It was one of those evenings when the air felt thick, the sky threatening rain that never came. I had spent the better part of an hour tidying up, trying to shake the restlessness that had been clinging to me all day. By the time I finally made my way upstairs, I was exhausted but still too wound up to sleep. I changed into a loose-fitting tank top and pajama shorts, letting the cool fabric settle against my skin, and stood by the dresser brushing my hair. The mirror caught the faint glow of the living room lights I'd left on downstairs, and I frowned, realizing I'd forgotten to close the curtains. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. The house sat on a large piece of land, the yard sprawling between the main house and the guest house where Nathan stayed. There was no one around for miles. But as I made my way back down the stairs, I hesitated at the bottom, something tugging at the edge of my thoughts. When I reached the window, I froze. Through the open curtains, across the yard, I could see the light on in Nathan's guest house. The blinds were drawn up just enough to reveal him sitting at the small desk by the window. His laptop screen cast a faint blue glow across his face, and he seemed absorbed in whatever he was doing. I should have turned away. Should have closed the curtains and gone back upstairs. But before I could, he looked up. Our eyes met, the distance between us doing nothing to lessen the impact of his gaze. For a moment, I couldn't move, caught in the intensity of his stare. His expression wasn't one of embarrassment or surprise. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't name but felt deep in my chest. The spell broke when I reached up to pull the curtains closed, my hands trembling slightly as I yanked the fabric together. My breath came fast and shallow as I stood there, the weight of the moment settling over me. What had I been thinking? Standing there like that? Watching him? Letting him watch me? I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my racing heart. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. It was just an accident. But as I climbed the stairs and slipped back into bed, I couldn't shake the image of him, the way his eyes lingered, the way my pulse quickened under his gaze. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a simple glance. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, painting the countertops in soft gold. I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a mechanical precision that came from years of habit. The scent of coffee filled the air, rich and familiar, but it did little to steady the unease lingering from the night before. I hadn't slept well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nathan's face in the dim glow of his guesthouse window, the way his gaze had locked on mine through the open curtains. It was a look that had stayed with me, unsettling in its intensity, though I couldn't quite bring myself to name why. The sound of the screen door creaking open pulled me from my thoughts. Nathan stepped into the kitchen, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans that clung to his lean athletic frame. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," I replied, glancing over my shoulder. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Pancakes, huh? You must be in a good mood." I let out a soft laugh, though it felt forced. It's just what was in the pantry. Nathan arched a brow, his smile widening. "You say that like I didn't see the stash of frozen waffles last week." Fine, I admitted, shaking my head. Maybe I felt like cooking? Lucky me, he teased, grabbing a mug from the cabinet and pouring himself a cup of coffee. I busied myself with the pancakes, flipping the last one onto a plate before turning to set everything on the table. Nathan was already there, his long legs stretched out under the small breakfast nook. Dig in, I said, sliding the plate toward him. He didn't hesitate, grabbing a pancake and drowning it in syrup. You know, he said between bites, I could get used to this. What? I asked, sitting across from him. This, he said, gesturing to the plate. A real breakfast. Someone to talk to in the morning. I frowned slightly, his words catching me off guard. You didn't have that before? Nathan shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. Not really. Living alone, it's easy to fall into bad habits. Grabbing a granola bar on the way out the door, eating takeout at midnight. That doesn't sound very sustainable, I said softly. It wasn't, he admitted, his gaze meeting mine. That's part of why I came back. I hesitated, my fork poised over my plate. To reset? Something like that, he said, his tone quieter now. I needed a change. And honestly, I missed this place. I missed you. His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. It's good to have you here, I said softly. Nathan's eyes lingered on mine for a moment before he looked away, a faint smile playing on his lips. So, he said, changing the subject, what's on the agenda today? Just the usual, I said, grateful for the shift. Some cleaning, a little gardening, nothing exciting. Gardening, huh? He said, leaning back in his chair. Mind if I help? I blinked, caught off guard again. You want to help? With gardening? Why not? He said with a shrug. I could use the fresh air. Fair warning, I said, smiling despite myself. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, mostly pulling weeds and hauling mulch. I'll take my chances, he said, his grin teasing. By the time we finished breakfast, the tension from the night before had eased, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of our conversation. But as Nathan carried the dishes to the sink and rolled up his sleeves to help me wash them, I couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrent between us. The way his arm brushed against mine as we stood side by side. The warmth of his presence lingering even after he stepped away. As I watched him laugh at a joke I barely remembered telling, I felt something stir deep within me. A mix of unease and exhilaration that I couldn't quite name. And for the first time, I wondered if I was ready to face what it meant. The garden was a mess. Overgrown and wild from years of neglect. It had been my husband's pride and joy, a place he spent hours tending to with careful precision. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to step foot in it for months. And when I finally did, the tangled vines and weeds felt like a reflection of my own grief, a beautiful thing left to ruin. Now as I stood with Nathan in the middle of it, a pair of gardening gloves in one hand and a trowel in the other, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. This is a lot, Nathan said, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the chaos. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. I told you it wasn't glamorous. Glamorous isn't the word I'd use, he said, grinning. But I like a challenge. I handed him a pair of gloves and nodded toward the far corner of the garden. If you're serious about helping, start over there. Those weeds have been mocking me for months. Yes, ma'am, he said with a mock salute, pulling on the gloves and grabbing a spade. I watched him for a moment as he knelt down and got to work, his broad shoulders flexing with the effort of pulling up stubborn roots. The sun caught in his hair, highlighting streaks of gold I hadn't noticed before, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Shaking myself, I turned back to my own section of the garden, determined to focus on the task at hand. We worked in companionable silence for a while. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional grunt from Nathan as he wrestled with particularly persistent weeds. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the warmth of the day settled over us like a heavy blanket. Hey, Nathan called after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. What's this thing? I looked up to see him holding a small, rusted garden ornament, a metal bird that had once perched on a stake, but now looked worse for wear. It's a cardinal, I said, walking over to him. It was your dad's favorite. He said it reminded him of his mother. Nathan turned the ornament over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. Funny, he said softly. I don't remember this. He got it a few years before he passed, I said, my voice quieter now. He used to joke that it was watching over the garden for him. Nathan smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against the faded paint. Guess we should put it back where it belongs, huh? I nodded, my chest tight as I watched him carry it to a nearby flower bed and stake it into the ground. By midday, we were both covered in dirt and sweat, our arms aching from hours of pulling weeds and hauling mulch. But the garden was starting to take shape, the chaos slowly giving way to order. We sat on the edge of the patio to take a break, a pitcher of lemonade between us. Nathan leaned back on his elbows, his face tilted toward the sun, and I couldn't help but steal a glance at him. You've got dirt on your face, I said, smiling despite myself. He grinned, wiping at his cheek. Better? Not even close, I said, laughing. Nathan leaned forward, grabbing the edge of his shirt to wipe his face. The movement exposed a sliver of his stomach, the lean lines of muscle catching the light, and I felt my breath hitch before I quickly looked away. Better now? He asked, his voice teasing. Much, I said, forcing myself to focus on the lemonade in my hands. Nathan watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You know, he said softly, this is the most I've seen you smile in weeks. I glanced at him, startled by the shift in his tone. What do you mean? I just mean. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. It's nice to see you happy. You've been through a lot, and I know it hasn't been easy. The sincerity in his voice, the quiet warmth in his gaze, it was enough to make my chest ache. Thank you, I said softly, my voice trembling slightly. Nathan smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't have to thank me, he said. I just want you to know I'm here. We finished the day by replanting a few flower beds, the once wild garden now looking like a place full of possibility. As we stood back to admire our work, Nathan let out a low whistle. Not bad, he said, grinning. Not bad at all, I agreed, my heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He turned to me, his smile softening. Thanks for letting me help. I know this place means a lot to you. It does, I said quietly, but I think it's starting to mean a lot to you too. Nathan didn't reply right away, his gaze lingering on mine. Maybe, he said finally, his voice low. The air between us felt still, charged, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But then he stepped back, his hand brushing lightly against mine as he turned toward the guest house. See you at dinner? He asked, his voice casual, as though nothing had changed. Yeah, I said, my voice softer than I intended. See you then. But as I watched him walk away, his figure framed by the fading light, I knew something had shifted. And I wasn't sure I could ignore it anymore. The night had settled over the house, bringing with it a deep, almost tangible stillness. The garden lights cast a soft glow across the yard, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. I sat on the porch swing, a blanket draped over my lap, a glass of wine cradled in my hands. The day had left me physically exhausted, but my mind was far from still. I kept thinking about Nathan, his easy laugh, the way his hand had brushed mine when we'd finished planting, and the lingering warmth of his presence that seemed to follow me even now. The creak of the porch steps broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see Nathan standing there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. Couldn't sleep? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not really. Thought I'd see if you were still up. I'm always up, I said with a soft laugh, gesturing to the empty seat beside me. He hesitated for only a moment before crossing the porch and settling onto the swing, his long legs stretched out in front of him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The swing swayed gently, the quiet between us comfortable but charged. Today was nice, Nathan said eventually, his voice breaking the silence. It was, I agreed, taking a sip of my wine. The garden hasn't looked that good in years. It's more than that, he said, his tone thoughtful. It felt good. Working side by side with you, talking. I don't know. It's been a while since I felt like that. Like what? I asked, glancing at him. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared out into the yard. Like I belonged somewhere, he said softly. His words struck something deep within me, and I felt my chest tighten. You've always belonged here, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Maybe, he said, his gaze flicking to mine. But it feels different now. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I shifted slightly on the swing, my hands tightening around the glass. I didn't realize you felt that way, I said after a moment. Nathan turned to me, his expression unreadable. You make it easy, he said quietly. Make what easy? Being here, he said, his voice soft. Talking to you, spending time with you, it feels right. My breath hitched and I looked away, my chest tightening. Nathan, I don't know if... You don't have to say anything, he said gently, cutting me off. I just wanted you to know. The quiet conviction in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze, it was too much. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by my reaction. I'm sorry, I said softly, my voice breaking. Don't be, Nathan said, his hand moving to cover mine. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. You don't have to apologize for how you feel. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's fingers tightened slightly around mine. That's okay, he said. We don't have to figure it all out right now. His words, his touch, they calmed me in a way I hadn't expected. I looked at him then, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time I let myself really see him, not as my late husband's son, but as the man sitting beside me, offering me comfort and understanding. Nathan? I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. You can tell me, he said softly, his gaze steady. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling in my lap. I'm scared, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I know, he said quietly. I don't want to hurt you, I said, my voice breaking, or ruin this, whatever this is. You're not going to hurt me, Nathan said firmly. And this doesn't have to be anything more than what it is right now. His calm reassurance, the quiet strength in his voice, it was enough to make my chest ache. I don't know how to do this, I said softly, my eyes filling with tears. You don't have to know, Nathan said, his hand lifting to brush a tear from my cheek. We'll figure it out together. The tenderness in his touch, the quiet certainty in his voice, it unraveled me completely. I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder, as the swing swayed gently beneath us. Nathan's arms slid around me, holding me close, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my loneliness begin to lift. We sat there in silence, the night wrapping around us like a cocoon. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone. The next day unfolded slowly, the way lazy summer mornings often did. I lingered over my coffee longer than usual, staring out the kitchen window at the garden we had worked so hard on the day before. The flowers we replanted stood tall and proud, their colors vibrant in the morning light, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Last night had left a mark I couldn't ignore. The way Nathan had looked at me, the way his voice wrapped around those simple, grounding words. I could still feel the weight of his arm around me, the quiet reassurance of his presence. But the reality of it, the truth of what was brewing between us, made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure how to move forward without making everything come undone. I was still lost in thought when Nathan walked into the kitchen. His steps light but purposeful. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and athletic shorts, his hair slightly mussed, as though he had just come in from a run. Morning, he said, his voice warm, as though nothing about last night had unsettled him. Morning, I replied, forcing a small smile. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the faint clink of the spoon against the mug filling the quiet. He leaned against the counter, his gaze flicking to me as he sipped. You okay? He asked, his tone casual but probing. Fine, I said too quickly. Just thinking. About? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. The garden, I lied. It's coming along nicely. Nathan smiled, his eyes softening. It is. You should be proud. You did most of the work, I said, trying to deflect. He shrugged, setting his mug down. I didn't mind. It gave me an excuse to spend time with you. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. My breath caught, but before I could respond, Nathan changed the subject. What's the plan for today? He asked, stepping closer to the table where I sat. I hadn't thought that far ahead, I admitted, grateful for the shift. Well, he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands braced on the back of a chair. Why don't we tackle the attic? I noticed a few boxes up there yesterday. Thought maybe you could use a hand sorting through them. I hesitated, my chest tightening at the thought of being in such close quarters with him. But the way he looked at me, so eager and earnest, made it impossible to say no. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's do it." The attic was sweltering, the midday heat seeping through the roof and settling over us like a heavy blanket. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the small, grimy window, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. "This is a treasure trove," Nathan said, his voice laced with amusement as he opened a box labeled miscellaneous. "More like a time capsule," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. We worked side by side, sorting through the remnants of a life lived and loved, old photo albums, faded holiday decorations, the occasional knick-knack that sparked a memory. Nathan pulled out a stack of old vinyl records, his brow furrowing as he examined them. "These are classics," he said, holding up a Fleetwood Mac album. "My husband's," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. Nathan looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you want to keep them?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't been able to let go of much. Feels like losing him all over again." Nathan set the records aside, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's not about letting go," he said gently. "It's about making room for something new." His words struck a chord and I felt my chest tighten. We worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of unpacking and sorting settling into something almost meditative. But the quiet didn't last. Nathan reached for a box on the top shelf, his fingers brushing against it just as the lid slipped off. A cascade of papers and mementos rained down around us, and I let out a startled laugh as I scrambled to help him pick them up. "Sorry," he said, grinning sheepishly as he crouched beside me. "It's fine," I said, shaking my head. Our hands moved in tandem, sorting through the scattered contents until one of his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, my breath catching as I looked up at him. Nathan was already watching me, his expression soft but intense, his hand lingering against mine just a moment too long. The attic felt impossibly small, the air between us charged and heavy. "Nathan," I began, my voice trembling. "You feel it too," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something that would break the moment, but the words wouldn't come. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." He started to pull his hand away, but I stopped him, my fingers curling around his instinctively. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world outside the attic seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of our breaths and the weight of what neither of us dared to say. The attic was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath us. My hand lingered on his, my fingers trembling, but resolute. For a moment I forgot about everything else. The labels, the boundaries, the years that separated us. All I could focus on was the way his touch sent warmth coursing through me. The way his gaze held mine as though he could see every guarded piece of me I'd worked so hard to hide. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, my voice breaking the stillness. Nathan's thumb brushed lightly against the back of my hand, his touch tentative but steady. "It doesn't have to be anything," he said softly. "Not right now." But it already was. I knew it, and I could see in his eyes that he did too. The weight of everything, his closeness, his words, the unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks, pressed down on me, leaving me breathless. "I can't," I began, but my words faltered. Nathan shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. But I wanted to. I wanted to say something, anything that would make sense of the storm inside me. "This is wrong," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked gently, his eyes searching mine. I had no answer. The truth was, I didn't know. Before I could stop myself, I rose to my feet, my hands slipping from his as I moved to the small attic window. The view outside was simple. Trees swaying in the breeze, the garden we had tended to just the day before, the guest house where he lived. But it felt like the walls were closing in. Like the space between us wasn't physical, but something far more overwhelming. Nathan followed, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When he stopped behind me, I could feel the heat of him, the steady presence that had always made me feel safe and unsettled in equal measure. "Talk to me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want me to say?" The truth, he said simply. The truth? It was such a simple request, but the words stuck in my throat. I don't know how to, I admitted, my voice trembling. Nathan stepped closer, his hands lifting to gently cup my arms. Then let me start, he said, his gaze steady. I care about you. I've always cared about you. And I don't know when it changed, but it did. And I can't pretend it didn't. His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. Nathan? I know it's complicated, he continued, his voice unwavering. I know it scares you. It scares me too. But I can't ignore this. I won't. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, my chest tightening. You deserve more than this. More than me. That's not for you to decide, he said firmly, his hands tightening ever so slightly on my arms. You're the only one who makes me feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I reached up, my hands resting lightly on his chest. The warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath my palms, it was too much and not enough all at once. Nathan, this isn't fair to you, I said softly, my voice trembling. What's not fair, he said, his voice low, is asking me to pretend I don't feel this way when I do. His honesty, his unflinching gaze, it was the final push I didn't know I needed. I didn't realize I was moving until I felt the soft press of his lips against mine. The kiss was tentative, almost hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands curling into the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. The warmth of his touch, the steady strength of his arms wrapping around me, it unraveled me completely. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a breaking of all the walls I had spent years building around myself. Every fear, every doubt, every rule I had clung to melted away, leaving only the raw, unguarded truth of what I felt for him. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. This is crazy, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, Nathan said, his lips brushing lightly against mine. But it's real. His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the storm inside me, even as it threatened to stir again. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Neither do I, he said softly, but we'll figure it out. Together. The quiet conviction in his voice, the steady warmth of his gaze, it was enough to make me believe him. For the first time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, we could. The morning light seeped through the cracks in the attic window, painting the room in soft, muted hues. I sat on the edge of the bed in my room, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The air felt heavy, still charged with the emotions of the night before. I had barely slept. My mind kept replaying the kiss, the way Nathan's arms had felt around me, the way his voice had steadied me when I was teetering on the edge of doubt. It was impossible to untangle the emotions swirling inside me. Fear, exhilaration, guilt, hope. A soft knock at the door broke through my thoughts. My heart leaped, and for a moment, I debated pretending I wasn't there. But the knock came again, gentle but insistent, and I found myself rising to answer it. Nathan stood in the hallway, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes warm and searching. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the faintest smile playing on his lips. I figured you might need this, he said softly, holding one out to me. Thank you, I murmured, my fingers brushing against his as I took the mug. He lingered in the doorway for a moment before nodding toward the bed. Mind if I sit? I hesitated but eventually stepped aside, closing the door softly behind him. Nathan moved to the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful, as though he was gauging every shift in my expression. I sat down beside him, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice quiet. I let out a shaky breath, staring into the dark liquid in my mug. I don't know, I admitted. Everything feels different. It is different, he said, his tone steady, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. I looked at him then, my chest tightening at the quiet conviction in his gaze. Nathan, this isn't just about us. It's about everything. About how people would see this, how they'd judge us, how they'd judge me. People will always judge, he said simply, his hand resting lightly on the bed between us. But they don't know you like I do. They don't see what I see. And what do you see? I asked, my voice trembling. Nathan's eyes softened and he shifted closer, his hand brushing lightly against mine. I see someone who's been carrying too much for too long. Someone who deserves to feel loved, to feel alive. His words unraveled me, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. Nathan, I don't know if I can do this, I said, my voice breaking. You don't have to have all the answers right now, he said gently, his hand curling around mine. We don't have to figure everything out today or tomorrow. We'll take it one step at a time. The quiet strength in his voice, the warmth of his touch, it was enough to make the fear recede, if only for a moment. We spent the rest of the morning together, talking in soft, unhurried tones. Nathan listened as I spoke about my fears, my doubts, the weight of the past that still clung to me, and in return, he shared pieces of himself that he had kept hidden. His own struggles with feeling adrift, his longing for connection, his quiet determination to find something real. By the time the sun reached its peak in the sky, the heaviness in my chest had begun to lift. Later that afternoon, we stood together on the porch, the garden stretching out before us in vibrant greens and golds. Nathan leaned against the railing, his arms crossed as he watched the breeze ripple through the trees. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, his voice tinged with quiet wonder. It is, I agreed, my gaze drifting over the flowers we had planted, the soft hum of life returning to a place that had once felt so empty. Nathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. This feels like a beginning, he said softly. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. A beginning of what? He smiled, small but sure. Of whatever we want it to be. His words hung in the air, and for the first time I let myself believe them. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the path ahead. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and perhaps even regret. But for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone. Nathan had shown me that it was okay to let go, to make room for something new, something unexpected. And as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a quiet sense of hope settle over me. We didn't have all the answers, but maybe we didn't need them. For now, the promise of something more was enough. It started with something so small, so seemingly inconsequential, that I still struggle to believe it unraveled everything. I was standing in the living room folding laundry when Jake called out from the hallway. Lorraine, can you give me a hand with this? I turned to see him standing by the stairs, his hands fumbling with the buckle of his belt. He was wearing a pair of khaki shorts that hung loosely on his hips, the leather strap of the belt twisted awkwardly. Can you fix this? It's stuck or something? He said, walking toward me. Sure, I said, setting the folded towels aside. I stepped closer, reaching for the belt, and tried to untangle the strap from the buckle. Hold still, I said, concentrating. Yeah, sorry, he replied, holding his breath as I worked. But as I tugged at the leather, the buckle gave way, and before either of us could react, his shorts slipped down to his ankles. The world seemed to freeze. My eyes flickered downward, just for a second, a reflex I couldn't control, and I saw everything before quickly looking away. Jake stood frozen, his hands hovering awkwardly, his face turning red. Sorry, he muttered, quickly pulling his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks burning as I stammered. It's fine. It happens. Yeah, he said, his voice strained. Thanks, for the help. He turned and hurried upstairs, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my thoughts swirling. It was just an accident, a fleeting moment of awkwardness. But the charged air in the room, the way his eyes lingered on mine before he walked away, it changed something. Neither of us spoke about it, but from that moment on, things between us were never the same. My marriage to Alan wasn't what you'd call a love story. It wasn't bad either. Just a quiet, comfortable arrangement that had been losing its warmth for years. We married when I was 44, and he was 50. Both of us coming off failed first marriages. Alan was a man of routines and hobbies. Golf on Saturdays, fishing trips once a month, and an endless rotation of client dinners that kept him out late more often than not. I had come to accept the silences between us as part of the deal, filling my days with charity work, gardening, and keeping the house in order. But then Jake moved in. Alan's son from his first marriage had always been polite and distant with me. I'd only seen him a handful of times in the early years of my marriage, during the obligatory holiday visits when he was still in college. He was reserved back then. awkward in the way young men are when forced into rooms with new stepmothers. But now, 6 years later, the man who showed up at our doorstep wasn't the shy teenager I remembered. Jake had recently graduated and was struggling to find his footing in the world. His degree in fine arts, something Alan still rolled his eyes about, hadn't led to immediate success, and Alan offered him a place to stay while he figured things out. I wasn't consulted on the matter, but I didn't object. The house was big enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind the idea of some company during the long days when Alan was at work or out with friends. What I didn't expect was how quickly Jake's presence would shift the energy of the house. He had an ease about him, the kind of natural charm that made people want to be around him. His humor was dry but disarming, his smile infectious, and his presence filled the empty spaces of the house in a way that Alan's never did. It started with small moments. One morning, I was trimming the hedges in the backyard when Jake wandered out with a cup of coffee, barefoot and tousled from sleep. He leaned against the patio door, watching me work with a lazy grin. "You're up early," I remarked, glancing at him. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to admire all the work you're putting in out here." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Don't let Alan hear you say that. He thinks this garden just takes care of itself." "Alan doesn't notice much," Jake replied, his tone casual but pointed. The comment caught me off guard, but I didn't press him on it. Instead, I kept trimming, acutely aware of his gaze lingering on me. Over the weeks, our conversations grew longer, and our interactions became a steady rhythm in the house. Jake would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, telling me stories about his college days or asking for advice about job applications. One afternoon, I found him sprawled on the couch in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, nodding toward the pad. He hesitated for a moment before handing it over. The pages were filled with intricate pencil sketches, portraits, landscapes, abstract designs that felt alive with movement. "These are incredible," I said honestly. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. "It's just something I do to pass the time." "You should show these to someone," I said. "A gallery or an art director. You have real talent, Jake." He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine. "You're the first person who's ever said that." The weight of his words hung between us, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Then came the belt incident, and everything changed. For days after, the air between us felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. I avoided being alone with him whenever possible, but it was a futile effort. The house was too quiet, too full of moments where we inevitably crossed paths. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, Jake came into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower. "Lorraine," he said, his voice soft. I turned, my heart racing at the way he said my name. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "About the other day, I'm sorry, that was awkward." "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. "Let's just forget about it." "I don't think I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Slowly I turned to face him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Jake, we can't," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I know. I don't want you to think it didn't mean anything to me." The intensity in his voice left me speechless, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Alan's voice called out from the front door, breaking the spell. "I'll be right there," I said quickly, turning away from Jake. But even as I walked away, I knew something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Alan, oblivious as ever, spent his evenings glued to the television or out with friends, leaving Jake and me to navigate the minefield we had created. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Jake appeared in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated before nodding. "Close the door." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I don't know how to act around you anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. "Jake, we have to let this go," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a moment, nothing more." "But it wasn't just a moment," he said, stepping closer. "At least, not for me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the truth. It wasn't just a moment for me either. There's a moment when you know you're about to cross a line, and that once you do, there's no going back. I knew it the first time Jake kissed me. It wasn't planned, none of this ever was. It happened late one evening after Alan had gone out to one of his golf buddies' poker nights. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when Jake walked in. "Can't sleep?" I asked, glancing at him. "Something like that," he said, leaning against the doorway. He was barefoot, his hair messy, and there was a tension in his posture that made my chest tighten. We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. "Lorraine," he said softly, taking a step closer. "Jake, don't," I whispered, even as my pulse quickened. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have to," I replied, my voice trembling. "This is wrong. You know that." "I know," he said, closing the distance between us. "But that doesn't change how I feel." And then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When I finally pulled back, my heart was racing and I could barely meet his eyes. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet desperation. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt electric, charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Alan remained blissfully unaware, his attention divided between work, his friends, and his endless hobbies. But even as he remained distracted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. The second time it happened, it was in the garden. I had spent the morning pruning the roses, the warm sun beating down on my back, when Jake appeared behind me. "You're always out here," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "It's peaceful," I replied, not turning around. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I think you like avoiding me." My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. There was no hesitation this time, no chance to talk myself out of it. He kissed me again, and this time, I kissed him back. What began as fleeting moments quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, finding quiet corners of the house where we wouldn't be disturbed. But the more time we spent together, the bolder we became. One evening, while Alan was out at a client dinner, Jake and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, my hands trembling as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered. "I'm afraid of what we're doing." He cupped my face in his hands, his gaze steady. "Then stop thinking about it. Just be with me." I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The secrecy of our relationship only added to its intensity. Every stolen moment felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled for, a reminder that there was still passion and desire buried beneath the routine of my marriage. But with the thrill came the fear. One afternoon, as Jake and I sat on the couch in the living room, Alan came home earlier than expected. "Lorraine?" he called out from the hallway. I jumped up, my heart racing as Jake quickly moved to the opposite side of the room. "In here," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan walked in, glancing between us. "Didn't realize you'd have company," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes lingering on Jake. "Just catching up," Jake said smoothly, his posture relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent a shiver down my spine. As careful as we were, it became harder to hide. Alan began asking questions. Subtle at first, but increasingly pointed. "You and Jake seem to be getting along well," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "He's been a big help around the house," I replied, forcing a smile. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to see that. It's good to know someone's keeping you company while I'm busy." His words were laced with something I couldn't quite place, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The first real crack came when Jake's best friend, Grant, showed up unannounced. Grant was loud, opinionated, and had a knack for picking up on things others tried to hide. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant said to Jake one afternoon, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just helping out," Jake replied casually. "Must be nice," Grant said, his gaze flicking to me. "Having someone to keep you company." The comment sent a chill through me, and I quickly excused myself, leaving the two of them alone. Later, Jake found me in the kitchen, his expression tense. "Grant knows something," he said quietly. "He's guessing," I replied, though my voice wavered. Jake shook his head. "He's not stupid, Lorraine. He's going to figure it out." As the weeks went on, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Alan's suspicions, Grant's remarks, the weight of our secret. It all felt like a storm waiting to break. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for Jake. And no matter how dangerous it became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Keeping a secret is like holding your breath underwater. You can only do it for so long before the pressure starts to crush you. Jake and I were good at hiding, but the cracks in our facade were growing wider. Alan wasn't stupid, and neither was Grant. And then there was Heather, Alan's colleague, who managed to turn her casual visits into something more intrusive with each passing week. Heather arrived one Saturday afternoon, uninvited but perfectly at ease. She had been to the house a few times before, always under the pretense of dropping something off for Alan. This time, she came with a bottle of wine and a too bright smile. "I thought I'd stop by," she said as she walked into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. "Alan mentioned you've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. I figured you could use a distraction." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile, "but thank you." Heather placed the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her eyes scanning the room like she was cataloging every detail. "This place is gorgeous. You've done such a good job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I said tightly. Her gaze lingered on the back door, where Jake had walked out only moments before. "Alan's lucky to have you, and Jake, of course. He's such a big help around here, isn't he?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's been great. It's nice having him around." Heather's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I bet it is." As the weeks went on, Heather's presence became more frequent. She found excuses to drop by, always under the guise of work, but her real purpose was clear. She was fishing for something, though I couldn't tell if it was information or Alan himself. "You know," she said one afternoon as we sat in the living room, "Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life. But I get the sense that things haven't been perfect between you two." I stiffened, my hands gripping the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its challenges." "Of course," Heather said, her tone laced with false sympathy. "But I'm sure it helps having Jake around. He seems attentive." The implication in her words was unmistakable, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Then there was Grant. Jake's best friend had always been blunt to the point of rudeness, but now his comments carried a sharper edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine," Grant said one evening as he and Jake sat on the patio, beers in hand. Jake shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "She's my stepmom. Of course, we're going to talk." "Yeah, but it's not just that, is it?" Grant pressed, his gaze piercing. Jake's grip on his bottle tightened. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying you're acting weird," Grant replied. "And I don't think it's just because of the job stuff. There's something else going on, and I think it involves her." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone. "You don't know what you're talking about." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Don't I?" The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like walking a tightrope, every visit from Heather like a test I was destined to fail. And Jake? Jake was becoming bolder, his frustration with our secrecy bubbling to the surface. One evening, as we sat in the library, he turned to me, his expression hard. "I can't keep doing this," he said. "Jake, we have to be careful," I replied, my voice trembling. "Careful isn't enough," he shot back. "Grant's suspicious, Heather's sniffing around, and Alan's not as clueless as you think." I looked away, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "What are you suggesting? That we stop?" He moved closer, his voice softening. "You know I can't do that. But we need to figure out what we're gonna do, because this isn't sustainable. The breaking point came during a dinner party Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, of course, along with a few of Alan's colleagues. Grant showed up too, his invitation courtesy of Jake. The evening started out innocently enough. Polite conversation, laughter, the clinking of wine glasses. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. "So, Lorraine," Heather said, her voice cutting through the chatter, "how do you keep yourself occupied with Alan gone so often?" I froze, her question dripping with implication. "The usual things," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Gardening, reading, helping Jake with a few projects." Heather's smile sharpened. "You must be very close then." Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Jake. "Yeah, Jake's been spending a lot of time here lately. I guess it makes sense. Lorraine's pretty easy to talk to." The table fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Alan looked between us, his expression unreadable, while Heather sipped her wine, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Jake pushed back his chair abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, leaving the room. "I think I'll check on him," I said quickly, standing up before anyone could stop me. I found Jake in the garden, pacing under the soft glow of the patio lights. "This was a mistake," he said as I approached. "What was?" I asked, my heart pounding. "All of it," he replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Letting Grant come here, pretending like everything's fine. It's not fine, Lorraine, it's falling apart." I reached for him, my hand brushing his arm. "We'll figure it out." He turned to me, his eyes filled with desperation. "How?" "Because I'm running out of ways to keep this together." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel made us both freeze. I turned to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face shadowed but his posture rigid. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alan stood at the edge of the garden, his figure rigid in the soft glow of the patio lights. I could feel Jake tense beside me, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, and my mind raced for something to say, anything to diffuse the tension that hung heavy in the air. "Alan," I said, forcing a smile, "we were just talking," he interrupted, his voice sharp. He took a step forward, his gaze flicking between me and Jake. "Funny how the two of you seem to have so much to talk about these days." Jake straightened, his jaw tightening. "Is there a problem?" Alan's lips curled into a cold smile. "I don't know, Jake. Should there be?" The weight of his words hit like a punch to the gut, and I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. He knew. "I think I'll head inside," Jake said, his voice steady but strained. "No," Alan snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll stay right here." Jake hesitated, but he didn't move. Alan turned his attention to me, his eyes dark. "Care to explain why my wife and my son are sneaking around in the garden during a dinner party?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The tension boiled over the next day. Alan was colder than ever, his clipped tone and icy stares making it clear that he wasn't letting this go. Jake tried to keep his distance, but it only made things worse. Heather, of course, found a way to insert herself into the chaos. I couldn't help but notice the awkwardness last night, she said as she sipped her coffee in the kitchen. "It was just a misunderstanding," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Heather tilted her head, her smile too sweet to be genuine. "Of course. But, Lorraine, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be dangerous, especially in a situation like this." Her words were a veiled threat, and I knew she was enjoying every second of it. The real twist came later that evening. Alan called me into the study, his demeanor calm but unnerving. "I've been thinking," he said as he leaned back in his chair. "Maybe it's time we made some changes." "Changes?" I asked cautiously. "Jake's been here long enough," Alan said, his tone casual. "I think it's time he moved on, found his own place." My heart sank. "Alan, he's still figuring things out. And he can figure them out somewhere else," Alan interrupted, his gaze hard. "This isn't up for debate, Lorraine." When I told Jake, his reaction was explosive. "He's kicking me out?" Jake said, his voice rising. "Because of what? A conversation in the garden?" "He's suspicious, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He thinks what?" Jake snapped. "That something's going on? That's his problem, not ours." I placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. "We knew this was a risk. We can't let this get worse." Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing this because he wants to control you, and I'm not going to let him. The night Alan told Jake to leave was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your things, Alan said over dinner, his tone calm but firm. Jake's fork clattered against his plate as he stood abruptly. You don't get to decide when I leave. This is my house, Alan replied, his voice icy. And I won't tolerate this anymore. Tolerate what? Jake shot back, his voice rising. Me being here, or me getting closer to Lorraine than you ever could? The room fell silent, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Alan's expression darkened, and he stood, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of this house before I make you regret it. That night I found Jake in his room, his suitcase half-packed. You can't let him win, he said, his voice tight with anger. This isn't about winning, I replied, my voice trembling. This is about surviving. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I don't have a choice, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. There's always a choice, Jake said, stepping closer. Come with me. His words hung in the air, and for a moment I let myself imagine it, leaving everything behind, starting over somewhere far away. But the reality of what that would mean came crashing down, and I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. Jake looked at me for a long moment before nodding. Then I'll go, he said quietly. But this isn't over. The next morning, Jake was gone. Alan didn't speak to me, and I spent the day wandering the empty house, haunted by the silence. But the real shock came that evening, when I found a note slipped under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Alan. But you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do, Heather. My hands trembled as I read the note, the implications sinking in. Heather knew. She had seen something, overheard something, and now she was using it to her advantage. The note from Heather was like a ticking bomb in my hands. I stood frozen in my bedroom, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand to know what she thought she had on me. But the truth was, I already knew. She had seen or heard enough to piece together something dangerous, and now she held all the power. The confrontation came 2 days later. Heather invited herself over again, this time under the pretense of delivering some paperwork for Alan. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and sharp as I held out the note. What is this? I demanded, my hands trembling. Heather didn't even flinch. She leaned against the counter, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Exactly what it says. Alan deserves to know the truth, don't you think? There's nothing to tell, I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Heather raised an eyebrow, her expression dripping with mock sympathy. Oh, Lorraine, you don't really believe that, do you? I've seen the way you and Jake look at each other. I'm not blind. My chest tightened, and I stepped closer, lowering my voice. If you think you can manipulate me with this, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy my family. Heather laughed softly, shaking her head. Destroy your family? Lorraine, you've already done that. I'm just expediting the inevitable. Before I could respond, the sound of Alan's voice carried down the hallway, and Heather's smile widened. Don't worry, she whispered. I'll handle the timing. That evening, Alan was quieter than usual, his mood tense as he picked at his dinner. Heather had left hours earlier, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the house. I couldn't tell if she had said anything to him, but the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, Alan set down his fork and looked at me. Lorraine, is there something you want to tell me? My heart stopped. I forced a smile, feigning confusion. What do you mean? Alan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You've been acting strange lately. And then there's Heather, dropping hints about things I don't understand. If there's something going on, now's the time to tell me. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I kept my composure. Alan, there's nothing going on. Heather is just trying to stir up drama. You know how she is. Alan studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. I hope you're right, he said, his tone heavy with warning. Because if I find out otherwise... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Heather's threat loomed over me, and Alan's growing suspicion made every move feel like a step closer to disaster. And then, just as I was drifting off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my heart pounding as I read the message. Meet me tomorrow, noon, the park by the bridge. Jake. The next day, I left the house under the pretense of running errands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jake could possibly want to say. When I arrived, he was waiting by the bridge, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. You shouldn't have contacted me, I said as I approached, my voice trembling. I didn't have a choice, he replied, his eyes dark with frustration. Heather came to see me. What? I breathed, the ground seeming to shift beneath me. She knows, Lorraine, Jake said, his voice low and urgent. She knows everything and she's using it to get to Alan. My stomach churned. What did she say to you? She wanted me to confess, he said bitterly. To tell Alan the truth. She's playing both of us, Lorraine. I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. We're running out of time, I whispered. Jake reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. Then we have to act before she does.